Good morning, English 123. Today I think I actually will make this a shorter video because I don't have as much content to go through. And we're at the point in the course where I think it's going to start becoming more likely like that. Where at this point I'm beginning to shift away from direct lecturing of content to facilitating how you're producing that content. So I'm going to get right to it. Okay, so in this week we are really talking about kind of putting a final note on how we evaluate research. That'll take a few minutes. And then we're talking about the annotations assignment, which is personally for me one of my favorite assignments of this course. I think I like to just touch back on what we had last week, just some final tips on how we evaluate research. Some people like mnemonics. Easy to remember devices that help them recall certain things. For me, one of my favorites is if you count the spaces on your knuckles and space between your knuckles, starting on a knuckle, every knuckle will be a month with 31 days. Try it. You have to put your hands together in order to do that, or you have to double back when you're on this one. But it actually works really well, and I've not forgotten the number of days in the months ever since. So for those of you who like mnemonics, 3 R's is a good way to kind of think about the research questions I was talking about last week. Relevant, recent, and reliable. If you think that your research piece can satisfy all 3 of those statements, you probably have something that's useful and probably worth including. I think actually something that gets lost in the last week's recordings, lectures, which, by the way, if you have not watched that yet, you absolutely have to. It's one of the most important lectures of the course. Relevance. A lot of times, one of the common things I see in student writing at this level is you find a source that looks amazing, it looks strong, it looks useful, but it's just not relevant, really, because ultimately, while it's talking about your topic, it's actually not providing information that's relevant to the point you're making. So you essentially create two parallel points, the point the author is making and the point you intend to make, and they don't necessarily meet. So be aware of that. It should be relevant to your subject, your purpose, and it should be helpful to actually making a point you intend to make. Recent, as I mentioned, go with the gut check of 10 years. That should cover pretty much all types of research well enough for your purposes now. As you get further into your academic and your research careers, you'll find that that's not a good rule of thumb for very long, but it works well enough here, with the lesson ultimately being you have to have current information to make sure that what you're arguing based on is still the accepted truth in the science or even in the humanities field. You can definitely bring in historical and primary research, but you definitely need a recent reliable research. And then reliability, bias is inevitable. We talked lengthily about bias last week, so make sure that you can really be certain that what you are looking at has credibility, and the credibility is based off something you can point to that's authoritative or logical. Those are the 2 critical parts of the classical appeals, ethos and logos, that help you determine if something is reliable. Notice how I didn't say pathos. Sorry, I keep bumping the mic. I'm still getting used to having a separate mic. Another mnemonic, those of you who like more graphical stuff, I tend to be one of those myself. Maybe just take a moment and screenshot this page as a way to essentially reduce what we had last week at length into one image. Obviously, the detail is greater there. But I think this still works very well for kind of showing you the danger to excellent zones. Keep this continuum of skepticism or credibility in your mind, going from the worst stuff of blogs, web pages, personal web pages, and social media, to the mid-tier, which is high-quality mainstream media, long-term reputable newspapers, to the best stuff. Peer-reviewed scholarly journals, books from academic presses, and some government websites and publications. I also want to give you a technique, 2 techniques actually, that might help you as you're getting into this week which is a lot of dense research calling and using. Hopefully you've already started that even before you turned in the last assignment on Sunday, the proposal. But this is something that I think is still worth repeating in case you have never really kind of developed this technique for dealing with a large portion of research, which will definitely be part of your career here at UNC, especially depending on the fields you may be in. So first pass or three pass reading involves essentially having three separate objectives that are divided into separate passes, separate read-throughs of a piece of research. And it's assumed that if at this point, if the research has gotten selected to be used, has been selected to be used, you've already called your research. This isn't something you do for every single piece of research you ever read. This is for the stuff you think is pretty likely going to be used. So it can seem a little bit onerous, but really, if you're only working with a handful of sources for a project, this is actually not bad at all. So your first pass is you simply read it, hands on the desk, you don't make notes, you're just reading it. Your purpose is to understand the thesis and key points of the text in the same way you read something narrative driven. When you read a book, just for your personal leisure reading, we don't tend to have pens and markers, some of us do. So that's meant for you simply to consume. Your second pass is where you start understanding the perspective and context of the author. You make that evaluating pass for the bias, the roles, the perspective that they approach the research in. That you can do somewhat quicker because you're really looking for some key terms that help you understand that. I think that without getting too into the weeds of what those terms are, it's pretty clear that you're talking about things like how they associate their methods, or how they indicate their methods, and how they associate their own history, their own identity with whatever institution or publishing organization or promoting organization they're part of. So you just make some notes on that. It's really meant to help you contextualize a piece as to whether it's something that you should really take further than that. And a third pass, this is where you do the analysis for construction of the text, how their evidence is put forth, the tone, critical elements. So this is where you observe the elements that may be useful for you to quote and put it actually into your paper in context. So I personally strongly recommend something that I've developed over time. It's nothing like revolutionary, but this is just a nice way to think about something that you hopefully have already kind of done yourself at some point. But if you haven't, this is something that you really haven't figured out a good method for yet, this can be helpful. It's called a power skim. Once you've selected a source that may be useful, I think that in most cases, just a 5-minute read is enough to determine if it's worth doing the deeper reading we just talked about. So this is something you've picked for past all the stuff you've simply come up through in research. You've put it into a pile of potential stuff and you moved on. And you've gone through maybe even that first culling of now that you're getting a better idea of what research is out there and what research you have to work with. Maybe you started with 15 sources in a 5-source project, and you've killed the first 7, just are obviously not going to be good for you to use because they're not relevant or they're not reliable. This is where you do the next level reading, which is simply to fully read only the intro and the abstract if it's present. And then you fully read the first sentence of each subheaded section, essentially the topic sentences. Then finally, you fully read the conclusion and the discussion if it's present. This is meant to orient you to the text. In most cases, of course, some styles of writing won't always work well for this. But in most cases, this will let you, in 5 minutes, get the point they're trying to make, get the key structure of the piece, the key subtopics, and the key points they're probably going to talk about, and their ultimate conclusions, their ultimate outcomes clearly in your mind. And then you can say, okay, this seems like this is relevant, significantly relevant. Then you go back and you do that deep reading. And once I started kind of codifying this process into how I always handle my research process, especially when I'm going for a larger project, I should say, it's really helped me cut down the time and the hand wringing that we tend to do when we're thinking, is this source useful, is it not? And then you kind of are left with only the stuff that's probably really going to be useful to your plans. So I find that to be a trick worth sharing. It should be said that any level of skimming is just ethically no substitute for the full reading that's necessary for research integration. And I use the term ethical intentionally here because it's unethical to cherry pick a couple of quotes without really knowing their greater context of the whole piece and just drop them in a paper. You may luck into the correct context to use, but you're definitely not doing what was intended for the project. And you're definitely not doing your diligence as a researcher. So the skimming is not your only stop. This is definitely your first quality stop. Okay, let's talk about annotations. The purpose of an annotation is a research tool. And like I said at the beginning of this lecture, annotations are actually one of my favorite favorite types of assignment to teach, because it's not often we get a chance to be so utilitarian and focused in humanities writing. Often we have longer pieces that take a lot more time, nuance, and depth to write, but annotations are very focused, very distilled, essentially sifted free pieces of precious metal when you're panning for gold or panning for other valuables. You've gone through the research process and you selected the stuff that's useful, and now you're creating the notes that'll help you come back to this process weeks, months, or sometimes even years later, and reconnect to what you were thinking when you first read the piece. So as I say here, the purpose of annotation is to collect the vital information and assess research suitability for later reference in a larger research project. There are 4 parts that must be present in a complete annotation. A source citation, introduction with a summary, assessment of the source, and connections to a research potential. And that's what I'm going to be talking about over the next few slides. Oops. So source citations are something that essentially is what would appear at the works cited page or the end citation of a piece. In MLA, we call them works cited. In APA, they're called references, and many other styles too. And it's important to make sure that it's formatted in a way that is consistently correct and matches the exact same information you'd see in the end citation. I understand that many of you will work with APA or Chicago, or maybe even AP or ASA or something else before this point. In this class, we work with MLA because we just pick something, and the humanities, it's MLA. And I find it useful for requiring people to still stretch out of their comfort zone anyway, because you're probably going to have more than one class that's going to have a different style format than you're used to. And sometimes you're going to come across the occasional instructor who's created essentially their own style sheet, and they'll provide you with that, and you have to follow that. Whatever it is, use the appropriate style that's starting the project in your type of MLA, or I'm sorry, your type of annotation. Here it's MLA. I encourage you to consult the OWL Purdue MLA website, as I've said a couple times, or if you feel like buying one, the MLA handbook. I don't think that's necessary personally. It'll take time, plus the Purdue OWL is what I always use myself. That said, if you ever get MLA error marked wrong, that you find actually is correct, you can always challenge me with one of those 2 sources. It's totally possible to make a mistake in how I apply MLA, so I encourage you to check your style and get better at it with me, as we both do, because there's always little style quirks and little differences that can stump us both. All right, in content. Summarizing is straightforward. You've summarized before. But here, this is going to be the most distilled, condensed summary you've ever done. 1 or 2 tops 3 sentences in this format is all you need to get to the really core information that describes exactly what the source is claiming. You're not building the argument again. You're simply here to tell us what they argued in a simple, direct statement. There is no time for fine detail. Maybe you can pull out one critical conclusion, that's useful, but you're not going to talk about their sample sizes, you're not going to talk about how they conducted the research beyond the broadest statements possible. You're not going to do more than say what they concluded or what their core information ultimately comes out to be. If you get longer than that, you're getting way too deep into this, and it's going to really imbalance your annotation into summary when you need to have room for the other 2, arguably more critical pieces. Next is assessment. You have to look at the source and say, Do I trust its reliability or rigor? You can ask yourself questions, or you can explain to your reader, which is you and me in this case, are there possible biases? Do I trust the ethos of the author either to talk about this topic or the ethos of the publication to provide information on this topic? Do they have a good process? Does the author have good background? Those things may sometimes be a no, and that's worth putting into it. I'm going to make a kind of overall statement about that in a minute. The final part, and let's go back real quick, roughly a third of your annotation should be the assessment phase. Now, into the connections. Consider how the source might be useful in your anticipated argument. This may change between your annotations assignment and your actual final paper. For instance, you may think the evidence will support a reason in your paper, but it ends up being actually a way of summarizing a counter argument, and that's okay. You may also even make the decision, as many people do, to have to get to the annotations, set aside a piece of research that you realize won't really be that useful, because maybe now you've finally done the real deep connections that you need to make it clear how it's going to work or not work in your paper. It is okay to abandon a source through the process of the annotation. Still do the annotation for the source because ultimately that's part of your research process, and I want to see that externalized just as much. It's good to see when you're making choices that show that you're choosing against sources. So make connections, possible anticipated argument potential. Also explain how the source compares to others you include. It's an opportunity to kind of create a back and forth between authors at an early stage. So if source one says whatever information that it provides critical detail to your research, and source two says, oh yeah, actually source one's totally right, or oh yeah, source two actually has a concern or a problem, talk about those two in this connection phase. So if there's conflicts, that's the word, or confirmations, that's a good time to put here too. Again, this should roughly be a third, maybe even a little bit more to your overall piece. Sorry, you're going to hear my cat going off. He's still roughly one-ish, and he's still kind of figuring out when he wants to talk and when he doesn't. Plus, he's Siamese, so it's okay. A sample annotation with comments and markup is available on Canvas on our front page. I've already linked that there. All right. It is important that you use the annotations assignment to begin significant research. The guidelines are available on our front page, but brief overview here. 5 scholarly sources, 2 directly from UNC library sources, all published within the past 10 years. Make sure that you have the unique format of an MLA annotation observed. It has some quirks. It has the citation at the beginning with no works cited page. It has a different margin for the body of the piece. And it has that breakdown of content I've already talked about here at length. It's worth noting that the range I give you of 200 to 250 words helps you know when you're probably doing too much or too little. If you're getting a much over 250, you've probably summarized too much and you need to rebalance that down. If it's too short, if you're having trouble getting to 180 or 190, much less 200, that probably means you're not developing a good reflection or assessment of the piece. You're probably just summarizing it and moving on without giving us greater context of what it means to research potential. I do check all the MLA when I grade this, but a little trick I've used is I assess 2 annotation content sets at random. What I mean is I'm going to essentially roll the dice. And so if I roll 1 and 4, and those are your strongest pieces, that works well. But if I roll 1 and 4 and this happen to be your weakest pieces, I consider that. I do this because I believe that annotations need to be equal, whether they're a strong source, a middle source, or a weak source. Ivan is vocal. Just make sure that you treat them all equally. That way, whatever I pick, nothing gets left behind. It has happened before that if someone just doesn't get to it and they don't write a 5th annotation, and I roll a 5, I'm essentially only grading the content of 1 annotation, even if there are 3 others I could use. This is for a reason, but I will check the MLA style accuracy on all of these. All right, to do. Oops, not of course text. But I do want you to watch the Google Scholar video that I mentioned last week. It is available under the other readings and text and other materials tab. It's useful. It gives good information how to use Google Scholar if you somehow haven't used it very much at this point. Google Scholar is absolutely different than regular Google. Please get the difference clear. It's a short video, and it's definitely a requirement to understand how to use Google well. Two things are due this week, aside from the final that's due at the end of the weekend. So there's one quick write due, that's the sample annotation. Turn in one sample annotation you have collected for your annotations assignment. Essentially, you're doing one before you actually even turn it in. Following the exact same guidelines as the annotations assignment, I will provide feedback on Friday. That's due at the same time as your draft for the workshop. And I do that because I want you to give me one sample that you think is good representation of how well you've done the balance of information and the balance of, or the correct content format. That way I can give you direct statements saying, for MLA, no, this is great, no, this is definitely wrong, recheck this. You're using too much summary, you're using not enough connection, so definitely take advantage of that. That combined with your workshops really means that your annotation should be pretty much an easy full credit. Yes, and the draft workshop is still due the same day. All right, so it's been a little weird with interruptions today. So I want you to take advantage of this annotation as one of the most useful assignments you'll probably do in any of your first year comp or composition related classes. It's super useful. I return to my annotations years later because I come back to a source that I want to use in research that I haven't read in 2 or 3 years. And it's way easier to reorient myself to a text with a couple minutes of reading my own notes on it at that time when I first read it than trying to reskim, reorient, and renote everything that I may have already thought before. All right, that's it for this video. I hope everything's going well. I'll have feedback and some overall comments to your proposals tomorrow and as part of Wednesday's lecture. So until then, take care of yourself. Bye.